So my name's Oliver Money-Kyrle, and I'm the head of European advocacy at the International Press Institute. So it's a global organisation of leading editors and journalists that fight for media freedoms and journalistic standards. IPI is just over 70 years old, which means that it has its roots in the Cold War era of the early 1950s, as the world split east and west between censorship and freedom. IPI is also based in Vienna, and so is particularly well placed to understand the forces at work in Central and Eastern Europe, where the EU's media freedom crisis is arguably most stark. So the question was, is the freedom of the press guaranteed in Europe? That's a difficult one to answer simply, but I would suggest look around you. Firstly, there has been a dramatic rise in violence against journalists. Journalists are discredited on a daily basis, often by leading politicians who prefer to insult a reporter instead of responding to their questions. Many politicians go further and accuse critical journalists of treachery and acting in the interests of foreign states. Their public attacks create hostile climates, triggering armies of trolls to target journalists with threats of violence. Women journalists, as we know, are particularly targeted with misogyny and threats of sexual violence. This online aggression has spilt onto the streets in recent years, where journalists are assaulted by the police or by the public, often when reporting demonstrations, and where the anger of the crowds are directed against so-called treacherous media or the Luger press. Threats of violence and actual violence go unpunished. Murders in Europe used to be unthinkable, but now they are a reality. Malta, Slovakia, Greece, and most recently the Netherlands have all seen well-known investigative journalists silenced by professional hired assassins. The subsequent investigations are often obstructed and undermined at every turn by corrupted judges and compromised prosecutors, often beholden to the politicians who benefit most from the silencing of the journalists. Such situations were unthinkable until Daphne Caruana Galizia was blown up in October 2017. At the time, Daphne was facing 35 slaps when she was killed. SLAPS, that's the acronym for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. It's another way of explaining the vexatious lawsuits that are taken out by the rich and the powerful to silence journalists and others who expose their wrongdoing. SLAPS didn't silence Daphne, but they silenced journalists, hundreds of journalists across Europe every year. Those that resist and defend themselves are often outgunned by the most expensive and ruthless legal teams, sometimes forced even to defend themselves in foreign courts. Even if the journalists eventually win, they may be left with huge legal costs, and meanwhile, months of time and resources have been lost in fighting the case, preventing them from doing their day job, holding people to account. Often, just the receipt of a lawyer's letter threatening action is enough to convince most journalists, A, that they are onto something important, and B, that it is too risky to pursue further. More recently, journalists have had to contend with illegal surveillance, the misuse of Pegasus or predator spyware by state security services. Governments have targeted critical media in Hungary and those reporting the migrant crisis in Greece. The fear that this may be just the tip of the iceberg, and how such powers may be exploited also by non-state actors, is a cause for huge alarm. Then there is media capture. Media capture invented in the Kremlin and exported to the European Union through Hungary. Media capture is the abuse of state powers by unscrupulous and often populist politicians to take control over the media. There are four main elements to this. Public broadcasters are targeted first with threats and intimidation. Oversight boards and management positions are filled with political allies. Journalism is neutered. And in some countries, public broadcasters are converted into plain party propaganda, cheerleaders of government achievements and attack dogs against the critics. Media regulators are filled with party allies and used to threaten critical media, denying or removing broadcast licenses, blocking mergers and creating barriers to an economic investment. State advertising is directed towards political allies in media while withdrawing it from their critics. Private businesses are also drop advertising for fear of damaging relations with the state. And you don't have to be a populist politician in a young democracy to use such tricks. 2 years ago, Austrian Chancellor Kurz was forced to resign following revelations of misusing state funds to buy favourable coverage. Media capture is further expanded through alliances with oligarchs who take over large media to provide favourable coverage. These same oligarchs are then often fabulously rewarded with lucrative contracts in other industries. Media capture does not create the dramatic headlines. Newsrooms are not raided. Journalists are not prosecuted. Instead, a slow and insidious takeover of media is conducted out of sight and at arm's length from political leaders instructing it. The leading proponent within the EU is, of course, Hungary, where Fidesz won a supermajority last April. In an election campaign with a leading opposition candidate was afforded under 10 minutes on public media throughout the entire campaign. The EU's failure to confront the media crisis in Hungary has encouraged many other political parties to adopt similar tactics throughout the region, creating a profound crisis of legitimacy and democracy. Probably the primary underlying cause of the drop in media freedom has been the collapse of the economic model on which modern journalism was founded. The catastrophic loss of advertising revenue redirected to the social media platforms who have grown fat on the back of the work of journalists has decimated newsrooms. Profits, revenue, and sustainability are all essential for quality journalism, enabling journalists to do what they should do, to hold power to account. Economic independence is fundamental to journalistic independence. In Central and Eastern Europe, the retreat of foreign-owned media or foreign owners from Central and Eastern Europe, following the collapse in profits and the 2008 financial crisis, paved the way for national oligarchs to take over the media. Such oligarchs had often grown rich in state-funded industries such as energy or construction, and saw the purchase of media as an opportunity to protect their vested interests and their relations with the state. They did not purchase for profit, but for influence. Media's overdependence on its financial backers, whether in Central and Eastern Europe or elsewhere, is a driving force behind the decline of editorial freedoms. And this brings us to disinformation. The retreat of quality journalism created a vacuum exploited by well-funded disinformation actors on which populist movements thrive. They sow doubt and division, conspiracy and discord. They exploit widespread public anxiety and fear, offering simple answers instead of difficult or complex truths. All sorts of actors seek to influence public opinion, from the comparatively mild practice of corporate lobbyists sponsoring media content, to ideological interest groups seeking to pervert public debate on issues such as the climate, COVID lockdowns and vaccines, fiscal paradises, or to question the legitimacy of elections and discredit the results. Disinformation does not need to prove another version of events. It only needs to sow enough doubt about otherwise demonstrable facts to pervert the public discourse and to undermine public trust in all forms of journalism. Disinformation is nothing new. It has been around since the invention of journalism and probably long before, but the power and spread and capacity to damage the public conversation has maybe never been so strong. Many in the media freedom field argue that the solution to disinformation is to ignore it, or rather not ignore it, but to focus on investing in quality journalism. A reinvigorated media sector would drive disinformation back to the sidelines of public consciousness. Solve the economic crisis and you can solve the disinformation crisis. We further warn that efforts to legislate against disinformation, well intended as they may be, will only lead to greater harm. for regulatory powers of censorship in the wrong hands will inevitably end up being turned against legitimate journalism. It is no surprise that political parties most in favour of such powers are those who thrive the most on disinformation. And yet hard choices need to be faced. Should the European Union have banned RT and Sputnik following Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Should other disinformation actors, perhaps also funded by Russia or China even, also be closed down? And if so, how? Under what laws and what circumstances? And how do you prevent those laws from being turned against journalism? Should social media platforms be required to take down disinformation, even when they have not breached any laws or on harmful content? And should media have an exemption that stops social media platforms from removing their content? The RT Sputnik controversy split the media freedom community, with the purists crying, "No, you have no authority. Banning one media is a threat to all media." Others argue that RT Sputnik was no ordinary media, but were controlled by an aggressive state and a central arm of Russia's information war. All of us agreed, however, that whatever the arguments for or against, there needs to be a clear legal process independent of politicians for taking such decisions. Today, these arguments are raging around the European Media Freedom Act, currently before the European Parliament and Council. Among its many provisions, the EMFA creates a European-wide board for media services, empowered, among many other things, to take action against third country media that pose a threat to the EU security and stability. An effort by the EU to create that legal, politically independent process for dealing with the RT Sputnik scenario. Then there's Article 17, which attempts, probably the impossible, to strike a balance between the powers of social media companies to remove harmful content and disinformation, while restricting their ability to block media and censor legitimate journalism. The article has divided the combatants of disinformation, who believe any privileged status for media creates a backdoor for disinformation actors, against media groups who want to carve out a protection for journalism so that the platforms are not the arbiters and censors of what does or does not constitute journalism, or more broadly, any form of legitimate speech. The biggest stumbling block is how to define and certify the media that may benefit from any privileged status to ensure that it is not exploited. It will be impossible to find a solution that suits both sides, but we must try, and perhaps this meeting will help advance our understanding of the issues at stake and how we can build the foundations for a free media unthreatened by disinformation. Thanks very much. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of this conversation.